Hey everybody, welcome back to the Vinyl Review. This is Billy with Wolf River Music, and I would like to just take a moment to thank you for all of your patience throughout our prolonged absence. And we're ready to pick up right where we were when we left off last time. We are now at episode number 5 in our chronological and our historical journey through time in the history of rock music as it has been recorded on vinyl. And just like I said at the end of episode number 4, I promised you that the very next record coming up on our list for review was going to be absolutely huge, and that it would be a monumental musical release with a message that was going to reverberate from coast to coast throughout not only the United States, but all of North America, Europe, and the rest of the entire Western world in March of 1965. In this episode, we're going to introduce you to a young man named Robert Zimmerman, aka Bob Dylan. And this album is titled Bringing It All Back Home. And this is not his first release. In fact, it is his 5th release. But since we started our vinyl review countdown officially with this particular record here by the Beatles in December of 1964, and so that means that we are picking up Bob Dylan's musical career now, here, with this record, which was released on the 22nd of March, 1965. Now, as I have just stated, he already has 4 other records under his belt, and he does have some very early success and notoriety. But these 4 records, as good as they are all very, very different in nature, both lyrically and musically, than the one that we're going to talk about and review today. Up to just about right now, at this point in time, Bob Dylan is known to the rest of the world primarily as a songwriter and a poet, a singer of what we would consider more traditional Americana folk music, rooted in the styles of Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and even Hank Williams to a certain degree. But he was also very widely considered to be an extraordinary young talent who seemed to have just come out of nowhere. And he was writing these epic songs with subject matter that were so many levels deeper than anyone else, at least in popular music, had ever dared to go before. By the time his second album of songs had come out in May of 1963, some very influential people, including musicians, writers, and well-known music critics of the time, etc., were beginning to speak of him as the voice of his generation and a once-in-a-lifetime talent. And some other pretty heavy labels that began to make the young Bob Dylan a bit uneasy when they began to be placed upon him. People also began to consider him as the newest guiding light, so to speak, in the realms of the American folk music movement, which was very, very popular at that time in the early 1960s. And some even started labeling him as a protest singer, which again, he began to resist these kinds of labels being placed on him, just like that one. Now, later on in his life, in interviews, he would begin to refer to these labels as weird names, and he felt that they were becoming very restrictive to him and his ability to grow as an artist and as a songwriter. And just that single sentiment alone explains a lot about this 1965 record that we're going to focus on today and review. It explains a lot about where it came from and why Dylan would want to record it in the way that he did. It was very unexpected when it came out, not only in the nature of the material that he's written about, but also in its overall musical style and delivery. And so, before we just dive right into the inner workings of this record, because there is just so much to talk about here, let's see if we can get some kind of a historical perspective on the early life and the early musical career of Bob Dylan, as well as just an overall picture of where we were as a nation during this very tumultuous time period. Because, as we're going to find out by the end of this episode, a record like this one it doesn't just drop out of thin air. Bob Dylan and his songwriting and his music are a historical product of all the things that were going on around him at that time. He absorbed everything that he witnessed or that he read about, and then he became a musical sounding board with an uncanny ability to reinterpret these events and these ideas in a way that virtually no one had ever done before. He could be dark and blunt, and sometimes even downright hostile in his writing style and vocal delivery. His music could delight you. It could impress you with its poetic wordplay and intellect in songs such as All I Really Want to Do. Or he could confuse you and or just scare the crap out of you in a song like A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. Above all, he could also cause you to reevaluate all of the American history lessons that you and I both were taught in grade school with a song like With God on Our Side, where he questions the moral ambiguity of all of the famous battles and the wars that have shaped the American landscape and our national identity. The lyrics for Masters of War must have been utterly shocking to many people when it first came out in 1963, because in the song, Dylan famously asks and hopes for many of our then current political leaders to simply die, and to die soon, so that he can stand over their graves until he's sure that they're dead. Now, Dylan claims that he wrote this song immediately after hearing the closing remarks from President Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address from the Oval Office as he was making his exit from the presidency in January of 1961. Now, that's pretty heavy, and it's beyond bold and provocative. Whether he was directing those lyrics right at President Eisenhower, or whether he was just trying to make some other kind of a statement against what he saw as the unnecessary buildup of nuclear weapons and the expansion of the military-industrial complex during the height of the Cold War period with the Soviet Union. His music was rebellious. It was iconoclastic, and yet also refreshingly creative, with an imagination that seemed to stretch to limits that were just so far beyond any of his other musical contemporaries or any of the other well-known or accomplished and beloved folk singers and writers who had recently come before him. Robert Allen Zimmerman was born on May 24, 1941, in Duluth, Minnesota, to parents Abram and Beatrice Zimmerman. They were Jewish Americans whose ancestors had fled to the United States from areas within what we now know as Ukraine and Lithuania after the Russian Empire's violent anti-Jewish pogroms in the early 1900s. His family was very devout in their Jewish faith, and young Robert was raised strictly in his family's religious traditions. He attended synagogue as a youth, and he went through the bar mitzvah prior to the age of 13. And for most of his young adult life, Bobby, as he was known back in those days, identified with the Jewish faith. That is, up until about 1978, when he went through a massive spiritual rebirth into evangelical Christianity. But that is a story for a much different day, not today. And that topic will be thoroughly addressed in a later episode somewhere else in this ongoing video series. The family lived in Duluth until Robert was about the age of 6, because in 1946, his father contracted polio, and so the family decided to move back to his mother's hometown of Hibbing, which is just about 60 miles to the northwest of Duluth. Robert's father had previously been a supervisor at the Standard Oil Company in Duluth, and the family enjoyed a very stable income and an upper middle-class lifestyle. But this unfortunate turn of events and contracting this terribly debilitating disease at the age of 34 left the elder Zimmerman unable to walk properly from that point forward, and it caused him immense pain for the rest of his life. And it also cost him his high-paying job. So the family moved back to the much smaller town of Hibbing to be closer to other family members and also for Abram to be able to work in a much less physically taxing job and to still be able to earn a modest living with his two brothers in a retail shop that sold household appliances. And so, it was here in this house, located at 2425 7th Avenue East in Hibbing, Minnesota, that Robert Zimmerman lived until the age of 18. And by the way, just FYI, while you certainly can drive past this house and take a look at it the next time you just might happen to be in Hibbing, Minnesota, please remember that this house is currently a private residence and it is not open to the public for tours. So please just be respectful. Also, please be aware that the street has been renamed to Bob Dylan Drive, just in case you get lost trying to find it. It has been reported that the young Bob Dylan did not have a fabulous relationship with his father, who was described as extremely reserved, authoritarian, and who most of the time just seemed to show little interest at all in forming a strong bond with either of his two sons, Robert or David. Now, aside from this unfortunate part of his early upbringing, Dylan wrote in his memoirs that he harbored no ill will towards his father, who lived up until the year 1968, and that he had a great respect for him and for all of the struggles that he went through on behalf of his family. Both of his parents were very musically gifted, and both of them played the violin equally well. The younger Bob Dylan grew up in a household surrounded by music and by musician guests who would frequently pay visits to the house to play musical numbers with his family. Okay, now it is at this point that we're going to start looking at some of the many different influences that were shaping the mind and the early philosophical outlook of Robert Zimmerman, both as a boy and then later as a teenager, who was enthralled by the music of Elvis Presley and also Little Richard. It seems like Bob Dylan was somehow able to build up a robust bank of not only memories that were both good and bad of his formative years in Minnesota, but that he was also able to later extensively draw on all of these memories in order to write songs as prolifically as he did. He also must have been very passionate about the music and the books and even the movies that he was exposed to as a youth. It's important to point out that because at least very early on in his life, his family was financially well off enough that they were able to be one of the first and one of the only families in their immediate neighborhood in Duluth to actually own a television set. They were also the owners of a very nice, modern living room radio. And it was because of this that the youthful Bob Dylan was able to be exposed to not only current television programs of the time, but also music, movies, and even newsreels that other kids his age just did not see or did not have access to. Sometime in the early 1950s, Bob was listening to a radio program broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry from Nashville, Tennessee. It was at this time that he first heard the voice and the songs of Hank Williams. Now, this discovery had a profound impact on him at a very early age, and it was from that point on that Bobby decided that he wanted to emulate people such as Hank Williams, not only in the way that he sang, but also in the way that he dressed, from photos that he would later see. Now, this radio that the family had in their living room had the ability to pick up broadcasts from as far away from the small-town life of Hibbing, Minnesota, to places like Nashville, Memphis, Detroit, Kansas City, New Orleans, Chicago, etc. And this was where he first was exposed to a brand new musical art form known as rock and roll. Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, Bill Haley and the Comets, Buddy Holly, and of course, Little Richard and Elvis Presley. He was completely smitten by this music, and by the time he began attending high school in Hibbing, he had already formed his own rock and roll group which he named the Golden Chords. And his little high school rock group enjoyed playing their instruments very loudly. So loudly, in fact, that they were actually escorted off the stage by their high school principal after a failed attempt to qualify for a school-sponsored talent show, because they were just simply too loud for the other adults who were present in the room. Apparently, they had attempted to play the song "Rock and Roll is Here to Stay" by the mid-50s doo-wop group Danny and the Juniors. But their amplifiers were turned off and immediately unplugged after only about 45 seconds into this song. It was throughout the rest of his high school years that Bob learned to proficiently play not only the guitar and the harmonica, but also the piano, where he loved learning how to aggressively pound the keys like Little Richard in order to impress his friends and to dream about one day becoming a big musical star, just like his heroes of the mid to the late 1950s. And it wasn't just music that he was really into at that time. He was also known to be a very voracious reader of epic novels, such as The Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men, both of those by John Steinbeck, as well as some of the more humorous writings of Mark Twain. Now, you would only have to look at the lyrics and the subject matter of a Dylan song such as Desolation Row to also get the sense that he was without a doubt heavily influenced by the books and the poetry of Jack Kerouac. And it was because of these classic American authors, with all of their keen sense of social perception of American life, especially in the way that the downtrodden protagonists in the novels or in the movies, books, were portrayed. This sense of fate and injustice, poverty, despair, and downright sadness in the lives of everyday working people have to be responsible for much of the subject matter that we later find in the writings of Bob Dylan's music. As a novelist, Steinbeck railed against the injustices of racism and the great divide between the ultra-rich and the poverty-stricken working people who were victims of the worst aspects of capitalism and the Great Depression. Steinbeck was also known as a far-left sympathizer of the more ideal and the philosophical aspects of communism, not necessarily of the way that it was being carried out politically in the Soviet Union or in Cuba per se, but he was more of a follower of the utopian ideals of philosopher Karl Marx. Now, this issue of philosophical or ideal communism and those that adhered to the idea of it, and then how it relates to Bob Dylan's own writings and his own philosophies, well, this is going to come up again and again in many of our different episodes of his various album releases over the decades. Playwright Arthur Miller, who also, by the way, was another influential figure in the 1950s who was accused of being a communist. He also had to have been a writer at that time period who had a profound impact on the developing mind of Bob Dylan. In his dramatic plays such as The Crucible, he railed against religious intolerance and the McCarthyism of the 1950s, all the while with a story set in a time and a place in American history that is known to have been both terrifying and barbaric, but one that was also whitewashed to a large degree in how we were taught to think of the Puritan colonists of the 17th century in New England. While we were taught that these were the people who had fled religious persecution under the monarchs and the kings of England, well, these were also the same people, more or less, who had succumbed to hysterical ignorance and the belief in supernatural wickedness, all to the point of putting 19 teenage girls and various other people who were all accused of witchcraft to death by hanging and by other cruel methods of execution in the years 1692 and 1693. In Miller's play Death of a Salesman, he questions the realities of what we have all been taught to value as the achievements of the, quote, American dream, unquote, and how easily it can vanish, lead to despair, and possibly even suicide. Now, take a look at a couple of Bob Dylan's songs, such as Like a Rolling Stone, with its themes of having everything and then losing it all, having to start over from nothing with a harsh new reality. And then listen to the lonesome death of Hattie Carroll. This is the allegedly true story of an angry and a drunken white man named William Zantzinger, who was from a family of considerable wealth in Baltimore. He beat a 51-year-old black woman and a mother of 10 children, a hotel worker, to death with a cane because she was too slow to pour him another drink of bourbon. This man was initially charged with first-degree murder, but he was given a lighter sentence of only 6 months in jail and a $500 fine due to the prominence of his family's business in the tobacco industry. Okay, so not exactly a lighthearted topic for a song that might possibly make a top 40 hit in this current decade, or in any other decade for that matter, but one that Dylan felt compelled enough to write about in 1963 because he had a hyper-inflated sense of social justice that permeated his thoughts and his music at that time. Dylan didn't seem to care if this topic made you uncomfortable or not. As far as he was concerned, you needed to hear about it. And if you felt uncomfortable, well, then apparently that must be your problem. It's also probably worth noting that at the time that this song was recorded and then released, William Zantzinger, who by the way was an actual real person at the time and not a fictional character, he was still very much alive in 1963. He was only 24 years old at the time of this murder, and naturally, he did not appreciate being the subject of a Bob Dylan song that recounted this incident, which literally took place at the Emerson Hotel in Baltimore on the night of February 9th, 1963. Dylan heard about it. He read the details of the incident, and then he wasted little or no time in turning this real-life incident into a song for the rest of the world to hear about in great detail. Bob Dylan was only 22 years old at the time that he read the details of this incident, and at this very young age he decided that he needed to make a very strong political commentary about racism in the United States in the 1960s. Also of note, the very day that this 6-month sentence was handed down to the defendant convicted of murder, not by a jury of his peers, mind you, but by a specially appointed panel of 3 judges who were all very well connected to the Zantzinger family in Baltimore. Well, this was on the 28th of August, 1963, and this is the exact same day that Martin Luther King gave his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to over 250,000 people in attendance. Bob Dylan was there on that day at the March on Washington, and he was there to witness Dr. King's speech, which most historians now believe was responsible for the eventual passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, that's just a little detail that I thought you might like to know, and I think that it helps to better set the scene of what exactly was going on at that very specific time in our nation's history. It almost makes it feel like Bob Dylan was there at the right time and within the right set of circumstances, regardless of the nature of those circumstances, to be heard in what very much seems like real time. Bob Dylan fancied himself in those days as possibly similar to one of the underdog type of characters that you might find in any of the 3 James Dean movies, for example, that came out in 1955 and 1956. East of Eden, by the way, another story that was adapted from a 1952 John Steinbeck novel, was a very early favorite of his, as well as the films On the Waterfront and The Wild One, both of those starring actor Marlon Brando. He loved these dramatically flawed and yet seemingly heroic characters who scratched and clawed their way to truth and justice. He also showed a fondness for the story of the outlaw Billy the Kid, and Dylan seemed to somehow identify with another one of these complicated and complex, misunderstood personalities of the old American West. These themes and these types of characters and stories seem to come up time and time again in Dylan's early work. All right, so this is what we're going to do now. We're going to put a temporary pin in this historical portion of the ongoing Bob Dylan story because we have him scheduled for a grand total of 26 episodes in this series. And yes, you heard me correctly, 26 times he is going to come up for essentially each and every single one of his studio releases over the years, starting from right now until, I guess, basically give or take about 2012, which is when he recorded the album Tempest. We're going to pick up his history again very shortly in episode number 12, when we review another landmark album called Highway 61 Revisited. We haven't even gotten to the part yet about his arrival on the scene in New York City in January of 1961, and then all of the various people who end up being associated with his life and his story, such as the writer and poet Allen Ginsberg. Then there's Joan Baez, who championed his music and who supported him while he struggled to make a name for himself. And also Susie Rotolo, who was so much more to Dylan than just this pretty young woman here in the famous photograph on this album cover. And like I've already said, there's just so much to talk about here, and we don't want to try to fit all of this into a single episode. Because if we were to try to do that, well, then we would end up with a video that would be somewhere between about, 18 and 24 hours long by my calculations. And there is nobody that wants that, especially me. So, here it is. Let's pop the hood and see what's underneath, bringing it all back home. Here's a good question. Why is it called that? What does it mean? Okay, well, there are a few different interpretations as to why Dylan possibly named the album in the way that he did. The title of the album is possibly a reference to his return to the musical roots of his youth. And at the same time, also the shift of his focus in his new songs away from universal concerns and over to more of his own personal conflicts. And now for the bigger question, and the one that I think that is the much more important one to ask, is this album great? And if so, what makes it that way? Okay, well, sit down and let's talk about it. As far as we're concerned over here, the answer to that is yes. It is absolutely great. No big surprises there. In fact, this could actually be considered the very first truly great album that has ever been made up to this point in time. Now, I did not say that this was the greatest album ever made in history. And at least in terms of this review series and this march through history that we're attempting to make, that distinction is still yet to be made. So let me clarify my statement by using some other recent examples. If you were to go back to episode 1 in this series, we spoke at great length about Beatles for Sale. And we also made it a point to talk about how those who were in charge of the money and the promotional funding to have these Beatles albums recorded and then marketed were very adamant about the fact that they wanted this album finished and ready for sale by Christmas of that year. So it seems fairly obvious that very often back then, as well as now, that full-length records are and were made in order to sell either a single hit song before the public grows tired of that song, and if they're really lucky, then they can be trying to sell a record with as many as 3 or 4 hit songs, and the rest of it can be filler as far as they're concerned. And we more or less pointed out that the same situation that was going on with this record was also going on with the Rolling Stones album as well as this Beach Boys record. Now, this album has no filler material on it at all. In fact, even though there was a single top 40 hit on this album, Subterranean Homesick Blues, there is no way that any record executive who was working in 1965 would have called that one as a surefire hit after first hearing it. Columbia Records released this song as a single 2 weeks before the full album came out. But I don't think that there's any way that they could have ever predicted for this one to be Bob Dylan's first ever top 40 hit in the United States. This song has complicated but clever lyrics, but there are also some very overt political statements on it, and people just really weren't doing that outside of the folk music scene in 1965. And they were not doing that at all in pop music, that is for sure. When John Lennon first heard this song, he lamented to the other members of his band that he believed that this song was so brilliant that he felt like they would never be able to top what he had just done. But Bob Dylan himself has stated, in his typical fashion of course, that the song is really just not that complex and that he was really more or less just trying to copy some of the styles of a Chuck Berry song, and that also he had just recently finished reading the book The Subterraneans by Jack Kerouac. Either way, whatever it is, it's all very good. He's making references to the civil rights movement. He's making references to the growing conflict in Vietnam, which, by the way, hasn't even really escalated to what it would become in just a few short years after this. And he's making commentary on the youth counterculture movement that has been brewing underneath the surface of society since the Beat generation of the 1950s. Every single word in this song counts. And all of it comes at you in just an absolute flurry, like a verbal whirlwind. And he manages to get all of this into a song that is only 2 minutes and 21 seconds long. Elvis Costello had an interesting quote about this song and how it inspired him to write Pump It Up, which was a big hit for him back in 1978, and I'd like to share that with you. He said, quote, "It's how rock and roll works. You take the broken pieces of another thrill and then you make it into a brand new toy. That's what I did with Subterranean Homesick Blues," unquote. Now, tons of other groups over the years, all the way from REM to Radiohead, from Echo and the Bunnymen to the Jesus and Mary Chain, and even the Beastie Boys, have all pointed very specifically to this song on this album as an incredibly important source of inspiration to them in many different facets of their own music and songwriting. And so, just to give you an idea of what songs were hitting number one that year back in 1965, here's an interesting list. When Subterranean Homesick Blues was first released as a single from this forthcoming album, the number one song in America was My Girl by The Temptations. When the full record came out, the number one song was 8 Days a Week by the Beatles. Then a week or two after that, and it was Stop in the Name of Love by the Supremes. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong necessarily with any of that music, and I don't have anything negative to say about any of it, but it should give you a better idea of what the general music listening public were accustomed to hearing on the radio at that time. The number one overall song of the entire year in 1965 was Wooly Bully by Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs. Remember them? No? Me neither. Herman's Hermits also had a couple of very big hits that year, along with Petula Clark, Freddie and the Dreamers, the Dave Clark Five, and the Four Tops. So, British invasion groups were huge that year, and so was Motown. Okay, so what about the song Mr. Tambourine Man? Again, no, this was not a typical sounding hit song for this particular year. Now, his original acoustic version of this song was more of a surrealistic, almost psychedelic, long, meandering piece that's 4 verses without even a discernible chorus section. It's 5.5 minutes long, which was far too long for any song to have been played on any top 40 radio station back in 1965. And to top it off, the term psychedelic music is not even a thing yet. It has not even been invented yet by this time. That song became a #1 hit just a few months later when the Byrds completely reinterpreted the entire song. They recorded it with drums, bass, electric guitars. They changed the key, and then they added these crazy good vocal harmony parts to it and shortened it to 2 minutes and 29 seconds in order to make sure that radio stations would actually play it. And since we're talking about Mr. Tambourine Man, why don't we just delve down a little bit deeper into that song in order for us to figure out maybe where some of the inspiration came from for such a unique song? Question: are these lyrics full of blatant drug references? Have a listen. Take me for a trip upon your magic swirling ship. All my senses have been stripped, and my hands can't feel to grip, my toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. Then take me disappearing through the smoke rings of my mind, down the foggy ruins of time, far past the frozen leaves, the haunted, frightened trees, out to the windy beach, far from the twisted reach of crazy sorrow. According to the author himself, in his own writings, he says, no, this song is not about drugs, even though, in the same interview, he also makes it very clear that he was definitely stoned and smoking a lot of marijuana during most of the times that he was writing down the lyrics to this song. What becomes more clear about where the inspiration came from for the lyrics to this monumental song is actually due to what Dylan was known to have been reading at that time. And even though his version of the song never really truly became a hit song on the charts in its own right, it is arguably the most famous and well-known song from this album. In fact, it probably would even rank within the top 10 best-known songs that have ever been recorded by Dylan on any of his records. During this time period, he was reading the poetry of the French surrealist poet Arthur Rimbaud, whose famous works include Illuminations and A Season in Hell. Rimbaud, as a writer, was extremely odd in that while he did manage to live an utterly chaotic, drunken, and a tumultuous life up to the age of 37, he only wrote poetry between the ages of 17 and 20. And then he just decided to never write again beyond that point in his life. He is now widely regarded as possibly one of the greatest poets ever in the styles of symbolism and surrealism, and his writing has often been described as hallucinatory and dreamlike. And at the age of 16, Rimbaud wrote in the Letters of the Seer, quote, "The poet makes himself a seer by a long, prodigious, and rational disordering of all the senses. Every form of love, of suffering, of madness, he searches himself. He consumes all the poisons. I want to be a poet, and I'm working at turning myself into a seer. The idea is to reach the unknown by the derangement of all the senses. It involves enormous suffering, but one must be strong and be a born poet." unquote. Now, you may or may not agree with any or all of that, but it seems that Bob Dylan may have been reading much of Rimbaud's work for many years, and this writing style will continue to show up in his work and many of his songs up until as late as about when he released Blood on the Tracks, which came out in 1975. Other songwriters who have listed Rimbaud's work as being influential to them as well include, of course, Jim Morrison of The Doors, and also singer-songwriter Patti Smith. One of the other sources of inspiration, which may have been on Dylan's mind at the time, was a very influential 1954 Italian film that he has mentioned before in interviews, known as La Strada. In this movie, the final scene depicts a despondent woman crying uncontrollably on a beach, and this may be where he received inspiration for some of the lyrical content of the song as well. And again, we only know this simply because he has chosen to make reference to this film when asked specifically about these lyrics. There's almost 47 minutes of music recorded on this album, and quite honestly, there are just really no glaring weak spots to speak of. If I'm forced to find one, well then I can, and I will refer to that in just a moment. But until I do that, I think it's important to reiterate just one more time how important this release was in the advancement of the full-length album as an art form. Because up until this one was released, no one had raised the bar this high or this suddenly, and this caused many, many other highly creative and talented artists to take note. The Beatles obviously recognized it, and they would eventually equal and or arguably even surpass Dylan with their own releases, such as the Sgt. Pepper's album and Abbey Road. Brian Wilson took note of it as well, and we ended up with Pet Sounds as a result. The Rolling Stones took note, and well, they did their best to keep up with records like Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street. And then, even later, we had concept albums by artists like David Bowie, who released his own Ziggy Stardust masterpiece in 1972, followed very closely after that by Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon in 1973. And so, by this time in history, the idea of the album as a conceptual art form was beginning to be sought after more and more by artists who were convinced that they too could compete at this level. It was almost like a quest for the musical Holy Grail, and the bar for that standard would continue to rise higher and higher. That is, until the idea of a solid and a well-built album of songs was all but utterly destroyed by the digital age of MP3 files, downloadable singles from the likes of iTunes, and then the final nail in the coffin, of course, being subscription-based streaming services that seem to favor the idea of singles rather than albums as being the more valued and lucrative method of releasing modern music to the public. Bringing it all back home in 1965 essentially threw down the artistic gauntlet, and then everyone else had to decide if they wanted to challenge the idea any further with their own releases. And just to drive this point home even further, in hopes that you will understand that I am not just making this up or overranking this album by saying that it has no filler material, please understand this. While Dylan may have been working on these songs and these lyrics for many months prior to recording the material, he only spent a total of 3 days in the studio with other musicians working on it, in Columbia Studio A in Midtown Manhattan. These recording sessions were described as efficient, professional, and ultimately very productive, but not necessarily described as tedious or difficult. The songwriter would communicate his wishes, leading and constantly pushing these musicians into uncharted and surprising territory that kept them inspired and focused. These days in the studio were full of starts and stops and then impromptu moments of inspiration, different ideas for how the band should approach these various songs, and then group discussions amongst the musicians as to how to best proceed. Some of these musicians included John Sebastian and Steve Boone of the Lovin' Spoonful. There was well-known session drummer Bobby Gregg on the drum kit, Paul Griffin on the piano, and Bruce Langhorne on the guitar, among many others. And Tom Wilson was working production from the booth. All of these songs that ended up as master takes on this record were all treated equally in their importance. After a session would end, Dylan would go back home and he would rethink and he would reevaluate what had just gone on in the studio hours before. He would come back the next day and they would end up recording this same material sometimes again and again, but in a completely different manner or in a style with different instrumentation, different tempos, etc. And sometimes even with completely different personnel playing the various musical instruments. Dylan ended up leaving much of this recorded material completely off the record entirely if he concluded that some of the songs just didn't fit with the direction that he was going for. He had some song ideas that he had held over from his last recording session that he would try again, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. He was treating this record as if it were a complete statement, and he was determined that everything that was going to make the final cut was going to be exactly how he envisioned it. Here are some examples of what I'm talking about. The song Outlaw Blues was originally titled California, and it went through a complete reworking of its lyrics and chord progression until the song that we now have on this record barely resembles at all what it was when it first came into the studio. The song Farewell Angelina was actually recorded, but it never made it to this final record. He decided that Joan Baez would probably do a better version of the song herself, and so he simply gave it to her. The exact same thing was done with the song Love Is Just a Four-Letter Word, which was also eventually recorded by Joan Baez in 1968. I'll Keep It With Mine was attempted and then abandoned, only later to be given to singer Judy Collins, who recorded it that same year, as did German avant-garde singer Nico. And also, Fairport Convention released their own version of this same song in 1969. The band Manfred Mann took a rejected song from these sessions called If You Gotta Go, Go Now, and they turned it into a hit that reached number 2 on the Billboard charts a mere 6 months later. So, as you can see here, even the material that Dylan ultimately decided to record and yet still leave off of the final record was not junk. This was good material, but he decided that it either just didn't fit in with the rest of the songs, or else he just couldn't make a decision as to how to record this material in the way that he initially thought that he wanted to. Another perfect example of this is, again, going back to the song Mr. Tambourine Man. The song was recorded at this time in several different ways, but Dylan was torn between the idea of this song being strictly an acoustic version or whether or not it was going to be played by the full band with the drums, bass, electric guitar, etc. He eventually, but somewhat reluctantly, decided to go with the more acoustic version that we find here. When he found out later about the Byrds rehearsing his song for inclusion on their own debut album, he was actually very supportive of this idea, and he encouraged them to record it in the style that they had in mind. And of course, it was the right decision, because you know how the rest of that story ends and how it turned out for everybody involved. Now, before I conclude this review, I had previously mentioned that if I were forced to find a weak point in this record, that I would. So, to be totally fair, here it is. The only weak point that I could find here, which is still not really a weak point at all, would have to be with one of the previously mentioned songs, Outlaw Blues. I personally found this particular track to just be less memorable overall than the rest of the record. Again, the lyrics are bold, they're compelling, And when he brings up the part about declaring his love for a, quote, brown-skinned woman, unquote, from Jackson, I presume he means Jackson, Mississippi. And he is touching on a very taboo piece of subject matter for that time period. During the Jim Crow era and prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not only were interracial relationships considered completely taboo in the Deep South, but they were also essentially illegal. And being this brazen about that subject is something that, if you were white, could get you at the least beaten up very badly and run out of town. Or if you weren't white, it could possibly even get you killed. It wasn't a joke. You might be aware of the song Brown-Eyed Girl, which was a huge hit for Van Morrison, who of course was Irish and definitely not well acquainted with American culture in the Deep South. But are you also aware that the original title and lyrics to that song were actually Brown-Skinned Girl? Yes, they were. The owner of Bang Records, which was based in New York City, when they heard the demo version of this song, they insisted that the lyrics and the title be changed, or else they were not going to pay for the recording of this song. And why, you might ask? Very simply, because they were afraid that the song would be rejected by most, if not all, of the radio stations located in the southeastern parts of the United States. And that would cost them money. So, Van Morrison relented, and he agreed to make that change. And then the song, of course, became a huge hit. Well, that was in 1967, not 1965. Also, by the way, just so you know, Van Morrison has always hated this edited version of this song. And he also claims that Bang Records has never paid him even a single penny in royalties for this massive hit. Anyway, back to Outlaw Blues. All I can say is that this song is a very typical rhythm and blues type of a chord progression. And, there just wasn't really much there, musically speaking anyway, that seemed that compelling, honestly. So I just find it somewhat less memorable than any of the other songs on this record. But I will also add this, that I do appreciate the line in this song where he states that he might look like Robert Ford, but that he feels just like Jesse James. It makes me wonder if he's making some sort of a reference here, or he may be foreshadowing how he knows he's about to be treated once word of this new record finally gets out by all of the folk music purists who were mostly terribly unsupportive of his foray into the world of electric rock music. But we'll get to that part of his story in a later episode. For now, I'm going to wrap this up by giving this record a very well-deserved 9.6 out of 10, which is a solid A, and also a reassurance to everyone out there that Bob Dylan is really just getting started here. He has just started a run of no less than 3 records that are going to go down in history as quite possibly the most successful trio of successive releases ever. Now, whether or not he can top this one remains to be seen. Highway 61 Revisited, like I said, is coming up in episode 12. But before that, in our next episode, we're going to take a look at this one right here, released by the Animals less than 7 weeks after this Dylan record came out. Now, we'll talk about them and their very important history and their musical legacy. Please make sure that you subscribe to our channel if you can, and then come back and visit us again. This is Billy, and you have been watching the Vinyl Review. Have a wonderful evening, and good night.